Money. It's something we use literally every single day, right? But think about it. We rarely stop and ask the most basic questions, like where does it even come from? What actually gives it value? And what happens when governments get involved in the whole thing? Well, today we're going to crack open a book that has some pretty radical answers to all of that. Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money?
So let's just start with that huge question. I mean, really think about it for a second. Why is that piece of paper in your wallet or those numbers on your screen, why are they worth anything? How is it that you can trade them for a real thing, like a car or a cup of coffee?
Well, this book argues that if you really want to understand the money we use today, you can't just start with today. You've got to go back, way back, to the very beginning.
To really get what money is, the book takes us back to a time before governments, before central banks, to a world of just simple direct trade, barter. See, barter sounds simple, but it has a couple of huge problems. First, imagine you make plows, and you want some eggs. You have to find an egg farmer who, at that exact moment, just happens to need a new plow. Good luck with that. That's the whole coincidence of wants problem. And hey, even if you find him, how do you trade a giant plow for like a dozen eggs? That's the indivisibility problem. It's incredibly clumsy.
So the book's argument is that money wasn't some genius invention or a government program. It just emerged naturally. People figured out, hey, instead of trying to trade my plows for eggs, I'll trade my plow for something that everybody wants. Something that's more marketable. Think salts or shells, or eventually metals like gold and silver. That thing becomes the middleman, the medium of exchange. And just like that, through countless individual choices, the most useful commodity becomes money.
Okay, so if money just kind of bubbles up from the market on its own, what would it look like in a totally free society with no government intervention? This is where Rothbard paints a pretty fascinating picture. Now, get ready for this, because this is probably the most counterintuitive, mind-bending idea in the whole book. We are constantly hearing that we need to manage the money supply, right? But Rothbard just comes out and says, in a free market, the actual amount of money doesn't matter at all. How can that possibly be true?
Well, the logic is explained with a really simple thought experiment. Imagine a good fairy comes along and, poof, magically doubles everyone's money overnight. Is society suddenly twice as rich? No, of course not. There are still the same number of cars, the same number of houses, the same amount of food. All that happens is that everyone, feeling richer, rushes out to buy stuff, and they just bid up the prices for everything. So here's the crucial point. More money doesn't create more stuff, it just means each piece of money buys less.
So you have this idea of a totally natural, market-based money, and this is where the book's central conflict really kicks in. According to Rothbard, everything changes the moment government steps onto the scene. And Rothbard describes this as a slow, gradual takeover. First, the government takes over the mint, saying only it can make coins. Okay? Then it changes the names. So instead of trading in, say, an ounce of gold, people start trading in dollars. It seems like a small change, but it's critical, because it starts to disconnect the idea of the money from the actual metal. And that, right there, opens the door for the final step, debasement.
So what is debasement? It's actually a pretty simple but powerful trick. The king or the ruler would collect all the gold coins in the kingdom, melt them down, mix in a cheaper metal like copper, and then remint the exact same number of coins. He'd give these new, lighter coins back to the public, and he would just pocket the leftover gold for himself. It's a way to basically create money out of thin air. It's the original inflation.
And Rothbard argues that this old-school practice of debasement, well, it never really went away. It just evolved. Its modern name is inflation, and he frames it as a kind of hidden, sneaky tax.
Now this is super important. Rothbard uses a very specific definition of inflation. For him, rising prices aren't inflation itself, rising prices are just the symptom. The actual disease, the inflation, is the cause. It's any increase in the amount of money that isn't backed by a real thing like gold. In his view, creating new money out of thin air is economically no different from a counterfeiter printing fake bills in his basement.
And according to the book, the effects of this are devastating. That new money has to enter the economy somewhere, right? Maybe it goes to big banks or government contractors first. They get to spend it before prices have gone up. But as that money trickles through the economy, prices start to rise. And the people who get the money last, like salaried workers or retirees on a fixed income, they get hit the hardest. It's a massive, hidden transfer of wealth from the last in line to the first. And on top of that, it messes up the whole economy, creating these massive booms and busts.
All of this government meddling in money leads to a really predictable result, which the book explains with one final, famous concept: Gresham's law.
Now, you've probably heard the saying, bad money drives out good. But what Rothbard makes crystal clear is that this only happens because of government price fixing. It's not a law of the free market, it's a law of government intervention.
Here's the classic example of how it works. Let's say on the open market, an ounce of gold is worth 20 ounces of silver. But the government comes in and passes a law fixing the rate at 16-to-1. Well, at the government's official price, gold is now a total bargain. It's undervalued. So what does everybody do? They hoard the good deal, the gold, and they try to spend the bad deal, the overvalued silver, as fast as they can. Pretty soon, only silver coins are being used. The good money, gold, has vanished from circulation, driven out by the bad, overvalued money, all because of a government price control.
So in the end, the book presents this powerful, step-by-step case that the monetary problems we deal with aren't some failure of the free market. Instead, they're the predictable result of taking money out of the market and putting it under government control. And that leaves us with this really provocative final thought. What if the one thing we all assume the government has to control is the one thing it never should have touched in the first place?